Hello there, I'm Kirk.
And I'm Lisa, and we've put together some training on how to leave an Alive at 9 service.
So to make it a bit easier for us, we've got some slides. So I'm just heading to those now.
We'll start with some of the theological background to how we do things and why we do things.
Yeah, so leading at Alive at 9. So this is about 10 minutes on, theology, history, and some sort of questions to ask yourself. The big aim, it's always good to know where you're heading as you put together a church service for Alive at 9. And here's one Bible verse that you might have in your mind. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. Notice in that verse that there's stuff going on between God and people and also from one person to another. So it's good to think about what do you hope will happen this Sunday between God and people, between people and inside people. Answer that from Colossians 3. Over time, you'll build up a repertoire of verses and ideas from the Bible of what you're trying to achieve on a Sunday morning.
And we're now going to look at something John McLean has put together. He's an elder at Winmalee Prezi and also a lecturer at Christ College. Here's some of his ideas that you might find helpful. As service leader, you lead God's people in worship, helping the congregation to focus on God, remember the gospel, hear his word, and respond to that. You need to ensure that the service is organised to help that, and you also need to give personal leadership on the morning, calling us to worship and guiding us through worship. You also lead those involved in the service, helping to coordinate and support them. You are responsible for everything that happens in the service that morning, apart from the sermon. You should work closely with the preacher and plan a service which works well with the sermon. This takes some time and thought, so it can't be done at the last minute. There are some fixed points you should respect, but there is plenty of room for creativity around those. We aim to worship God in heart and mind, to enjoy clear preaching and make a heartfelt response, and to live as a community of discipleship. That is what you should aim to facilitate. The dynamic of worship is a dialogue, God addressing his people by his word, and we respond often by echoing his word back to him. We don't have to find our way into God's presence. He has come to us in Christ and speaks to us by his word and spirit. We enjoy being his and knowing him, and we commit ourselves to serving him. Keep that in mind as you plan the dynamic of a church service.
Even though we like to think of ourselves as contemporary and innovative, what we do actually does sit within centuries of liturgy and tradition. So it's good to just realise that and to look over something like a Presbyterian Book of Common Order from time to time, to ask yourself over the centuries, what have Christians done as they've met together? For those of you who've done live training with us, we looked at a page from a book called Imagining the Kingdom by James K.A. Smith. And what he's done there is tabulated what some different Christian traditions have done with their Sunday meetings, from a Roman Missal in 1969 to a Book of Common Worship in 1993. It's a little bit hard to see, I appreciate that, but perhaps you can sort of stop and enlarge the screen or something. But just good to see that dialogue and some of the traditions and approaches that have been adopted over the centuries.
So what aspects to include? An Old and New Testament reading. This is really important to include both, and the preacher can give you those. It just shows that the message that we look at each morning is from the whole big story of the Bible, and they speak to each other, the Testaments. Also prayer, obviously, and there's 4 types of prayer that we like to include: praise, confession, thanks, and request. This means that we're not just focusing on one or just our needs, to include all of these. And there's creativity around how you do that.
And something that we've thought about with Alive at 9, especially with children involved, is to try and make one of these prayers embodied or participatory this is an area where we're all learning and trying to be creative, but it might mean putting up some pictures of things that prompt requests or prompt prayers of praise. It might mean creating prayer stations around the room, or a spiral on the floor, or something where people are moving around. It might involve gestures, objects, colours. So that's fun to be thinking about ways of embodying or participating. And generally, we break those prayers up into two prayers, don't we?
Yeah, into praise and confession, and then thanks and requests. And obviously involving different people in praying those. You don't have to do it all as a service leader. In fact, it's much better not to. Of course, we have a sermon, the Bible's central. And when we have mosaic weeks, that's broken up into two smaller sections with other things in between. And when we have deltaic weeks, the sermon stays as one piece. We also have songs, and that can vary in how many, adults and children's songs. And we like to include the children around the gathering drum, especially, or with instruments or actions or whatever in their song. There is always a children's talk and children's activities. And one of the unique features of Alive at 9 is that they correspond. So what the children are learning is what the adults are learning as well. So there's dialogue throughout the week about that and reinforcing the message. We always have a morning tea when it's not COVID times. That morning tea is in the middle of the service as a break, and also it means everyone's included then. There's a community news and collection time, and there's a time for an interest spot usually if it's not the Lord's Supper, which is held monthly. The interest spot can be anything from an interview, a drama, a book review, a mission spot. There's freedom there in how you do that.
Just with the collection, most people are electronic givers, and under COVID instructions, we actually haven't been handing around a collection bag, but that's something to be aware of, at least reminding people about their electronic giving. Just some theological questions that you will face as a service leader that are just worth always having in your mind. Ask yourself, how do we create gospel-shaped worship? And by that, I mean, on the one hand, how do you express the fact that the gospel is done? That is, that the work of Christ has done all that we need to come into the presence of God. And then, but how do you express the fact that there is stuff for us to do? There are good works prepared in advance for us to do. So you don't have to come up with the perfect and exhaustive prayer of confession before God will hear us, or you don't have to conjure up an emotion toward God using music, because the work of Christ is done for us. But that's not to say that people should be passive customers at church. Hopefully there are things for them to do.
How do we create gospel-shaped worship?
No? We just did that one?
Yep. How do we create New Testament-shaped worship? Well, we remember that we have the Old Testament foundation where there were sacred places like temple or tabernacle, and sacred people like the priests or the kings or the prophets, and sacred days. And they were all fulfilled in Jesus, and we are now his people that his spirit lives in. So worship in the New Testament is in spirit and in truth in all of life. It's not about a special place or special people. And so that gives us a lot of freedom. We don't have to think that the building is consecrated, or that we have to walk through the gates. And this comes up a lot in the Psalms, that you need to be careful with how you introduce church, that people don't get the sense that it's a special place, or that there's priests, because we are a priesthood of believers.
How do we create Presbyterian worship? Well, in the history of the Presbyterian Church, in some ways Presbyterianism reacts against the overly ritualistic practices of medieval Catholicism. And so Presbyterians like to be simple and not ritualistic. And this is a really good thing, because it's an expression of the finished work of Christ. In some forms, simple means not singing any songs except the Psalms, and not even using any musical instruments. So that's part of the Presbyterian tradition that we want to honour. But we also want to say that ritual and the arts and so on can have their place, not because through them we come to God, or we can get any closer to God than the finished work of Christ achieves for us, but because we are human beings. And James K.A. Smith, following St. Augustine, talks about the fact that as people we are desiring, imagining, embodied, and formed by habits. So, for instance, if I arrive at church and somebody smiles and greets me, and that becomes a habit, well, my body and, in a way, my desires are being taught about the experience of welcome. And that in itself is an expression of the gospel. If my seat's comfortable, if I get a chance to raise my hands or use my voice or carry a cup of coffee to somebody else, in the way that I use my body, my desires, my imaginations, and so on are being trained, and those things are not unimportant. Where people sit, the gathering drum, a unique place for the kids to feel like they belong. All of those embodied practices are actually really important, and for you as a service leader, it's worth paying attention to them. Anyway, that's enough theory for now, so we'll stop there and then we'll create some other videos for you as well.